Um, but we've got quite a busy session this afternoon, so I want to keep us on time as much as possible. So welcome everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you coming this afternoon. I'm Sarah Mears. I'm Programme Manager for Libraries Connected. I'm here with my colleague Emma Daniel. Emma's doing all the techie stuff this afternoon. So yeah, hopefully it will run smoothly. You never know with Zoom. But welcome to you all. So it's a really exciting webinar for us. It's the second in a series of webinars with a special focus on reading and well-being. And this webinar will explore the outcomes of two recent research projects with adults around reading and well-being, and also share a case study around reading well-being with older adults from Newcastle Libraries. So we're going to be joined by Dr. Nicola Curry, who was a research fellow on the Leverhulme Trust Reading and Wellbeing Project, and is a lecturer in psychology at Edgehill University. And during that time of her project, she was we were really lucky because she had a knowledge exchange placement, and we were one of the places that she was with during that time. So we really benefited from Nicola's work during that time. And then Nicola's going to be followed by Helen Parker, who's the Reading for Wellbeing Officer at Newcastle Libraries, who will be talking about her experience with older adults and reading and wellbeing. And finally, we're going to be hearing from our friends at the Reading Agency, Dr. Karina Spalding, Head of Research and Evaluation, whose recent report, The State of the Nation's Adult Reading, was published in July. And I know I found that really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about that too. And if you could keep your mics off, you're already doing that. I know I can see that already, but thank you for that. Just while people are speaking, but do feel free to put any questions in the chat. Because we've saved 15 minutes at the end, so we can have a Q&A at the end with all the speakers. So we'll do that. We are going to be recording today's session, so feel free to either keep your cameras on or turn them off if you don't want to be on the recording, whatever you prefer. But we'll obviously share the recording afterwards, and we'll share the slides as PDFs afterwards as well. So I don't want to keep you any longer than that, because I know you want to hear from our speakers. So the first person I'm going to hand you over to is Dr. Nicola Curry.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll just share my slides. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and talk to you today. I'm going to be speaking about some of the work that I was doing when based at the University of Edinburgh, focusing on the relationship between reading and wellbeing. And today I'll be focusing on the older adult project findings that we have from that research. So just to give a little bit of context to the project itself, so this was a qualitative research project exploring the relationship between fiction reading in particular and wellbeing from the perspective of readers. And it was also in collaboration with our external partners, the National Literacy Trust, Scottish Book Trust and UCL. We had, as well as the older adults, we did have children aged 9 to 11, young people 15 to 17, and adults aged 30 to 50 involved in the project as well. So if you would like any further information about any of those groups, please do feel free to reach out to me as well about that. But as I say, the focus today is on the older adult findings. We were interested in, I mean, wellbeing is such a broad and subjective concept. And so we were interested in three sort of key aspects really that we thought might be particularly relevant to reading. The first being the positive emotions, of course, that you can get from reading and also from being a reader in general. The connection experiences that you might have either through connecting with the book itself or the characters, the location, the setting, the events within the book, but also all of the connection experiences that can happen socially in terms of being a reader, whether that be informal conversations with family members and friends, or whether that be through attending a local library or attending book groups and having those conversations and social interactions there too. We're also interested in personal growth and thinking about what we might learn about ourselves, about others, and about the wider world through being a reader, and how fiction might help to support that. So to do this, we used semi-structured interviews. So we had planned questions that we'd prepared beforehand. And with the older adults, these did last up to an hour long. So they are quite in-depth. There was lots of opportunities for adults to sort of talk about the things that they were interested in relation to their well-being and their reading. And then at the end of the interviews, we used thematic analysis to pull out the key themes in all of the interview data that we had. So lots of rich, detailed data to draw upon there. As Sarah mentioned at the beginning, I was also really lucky as part of this project to do a knowledge exchange placement with Libraries Connected and Scottish Book Trust. And that's just been really, really helpful in thinking about how we might be able to utilise some of this research for advocacy, for supporting the work that you do, and where to sort of maybe think about taking it next as well. So just to provide a little bit of research background as to why we were focusing on sort of the different age groups, but in particular in this case, looking at the older adults. We know that reading has this potential to support things like cognitive functioning. It can have positive impacts on health outcomes in terms of longevity and supporting daily life functioning. But reading fiction as well, in particular, can provide opportunities for personal introspection. So, thinking about past life experiences, perhaps looking into them in more detail, reframing things. And we had lots of examples of that within the interviews. It can be intellectually demanding, of course, and it can also help to support our social cognitive development throughout the whole of the lifespan. So, thinking about things like understanding the perspectives of other people, improving our empathy skills, and just supporting things like social interaction and communication with other people through seeing different experiences displayed in within a fiction book. One thing that we found in some of the previous research on older adults is that there can be a focus on sort of trying to derive emotional meaning from life, and we were quite interested in how that might influence the reading choices and also people's focus during their reading in this period in life. All of this being said, from sort of the academic research field, there's quite limited research really exploring sort of how reading can support older adults' well-being. And so it's great to be here with sort of Helen and Karina today and to be thinking about all these issues and all of our sort of pulling our experiences together and just thinking about where we could, take this next as well. There are a couple of papers that I've popped on the screen there that have looked at this, but as I say, there's very limited sort of academic research currently in this area. Finally, just to say that, of course, as we'll see today, well-being is extremely complex. And so breaking it down into these three aspects has been really helpful for this project. And I think it also helped in the interviews as well for people to think about their reading in different ways. So who did we interview as part of the project? So because this is a qualitative study, we tend to have a smaller sample size and you go into sort of lots of in-depth detail in the discussions. So we had 15 participants, 11 female and 4 male, aged 63 to 83, and they were all retired. We tried to sort of advertise the study quite widely via project partner newsletters, via emails, via X, but also via word of mouth at reading groups and by attending a wellbeing group for older adults as well. We would have liked the sample to be more demographically diverse if possible. Most of our readers describe themselves as either Scottish, English, or British. And I think in future it could be important to bear that in mind and think about how to increase that diversity there. The other thing to mention is that they were all keen readers of fiction. So they were all currently actively reading and really enjoy fiction and were very passionate about it. And again, I think thinking about the barriers that some people might face to becoming a reader or to taking reading back up again, if they've kind of had a sort of a lapse there with it. Perhaps thinking about how we can maybe use some of these sorts of potential wellbeing benefits that we can get in the best case scenario that we see here in this research and how we can sort of use that to help encourage reading and support reading again. But yeah, all very, very passionate about the role that reading's played in their life in terms of supporting their well-being. So in terms of the interview itself, just to give you a very quick sample of the types of questions that we asked. But one thing to say is that, these questions did really prompt quite a lot of really in-depth thought and really extended responses and really helped to sort of facilitate the discussions. So we've kind of built some of these into a reflective reading guide, which I can share the website link at the end. And if you think that might be something that would be useful to you, you're very welcome to have a look at that. But yeah, we had different sorts of questions tapping into these three different areas of well-being. And what did we find? So after lots and lots and lots of analysis on a huge amount of data, we've kind of pulled together these different sub-themes that fall under the different aspects of well-being. And rather than go into them in detail here, I thought it might be useful to demonstrate some of these with examples of the quotes from the participants themselves. So first of all, thinking about the positive emotions that you might get from being a reader, I think many of you will be familiar with many of the things that I'm going to talk about over the next few slides. But I hope that perhaps this is useful in terms of collating some of these ideas together in terms of advocacy, in terms of supporting projects that you might want to do. Just to have them in this kind of one report or paper together might be useful. But in terms of the positive emotions, we had things like hope, nostalgia, comfort, humour, escapism. And this came from the book itself, but also lots of sort of remindings of things from their own lives too. So the top quote on the right hand side of the screen there, and the participant was talking about how the book could have reminded her of sort of happy times in her own life. And I think one thing to say, particularly with the older adult participants, is often these positive emotions weren't just lasting during the point of reading, but they were filtering into other aspects of their lives. They were lasting sometimes weeks, days, or they could pick up a book they'd read years ago and automatically start to pick up on some of those emotions again. So it wasn't just limited to the reading period itself. There was a real focus on the essential role of reading and thinking about the library sector and the huge role that you play in enabling books to be accessible to individuals. And this really came through strongly from our older adult participants. There were concerns about deteriorating vision, about losing access to books via libraries, and that did come up throughout the interviews. And people were thinking about ways that they would manage to keep reading in their lives if that did happen. And I think that was just an important thing to flag there. There were also mixed emotional responses, as you would expect, depending on the book that you've read. And many of the readers chose to speak to us about books that perhaps had quite difficult topics or adverse consequences for characters. But they really enjoyed the kind of the journey and the emotional roller coaster and this opportunity to empathise with characters in those situations. You can see that an example of that in the third quote on the right hand side of the screen there. One of the interesting things thinking about moods and emotions was that for many of the old adults, the activity of reading of itself in and of itself, regardless of the genre really, was mood enhancing. So I think many of our interviewees knew the types of books they enjoyed reading, knew which genres they enjoyed. And so genre didn't focus sort of feature as much. However, on the flip side of things, sometimes we found that if participants were going through difficult life events, perhaps sometimes their reading would drop off a little bit and then they would pick it back up again. For others, they felt as though actually reading helped to support them through difficult times in their lives. And you can see that example in the fourth quote down there. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers today in terms of how this might all kind of interact with each other and how we can support readers to continue reading if they wish to do so. Finally, in terms of in terms of positive emotions, we had aesthetic appreciation. So just the real joy of enjoying language, enjoying reading as an art, and thinking about this from a social prescription kind of point of view, and thinking about reading falling into that art space. There was lots of discussion of that enjoyment and side of reading in terms of the old adults as well. Moving on to connection, as you might expect. I'm sure you hear lots of sorts of similar things in the work that you do, but lots of examples of connection with books, with characters, locations, and with authors. And we were interested in like the mechanisms behind that really, and the things that tended to kind of come through were things like its company. It's a source of belonging. We had people talking about how if they were experiencing a difficult period in their life, they could go into a book or into a book series they were familiar with and feel at home there and feel that sense of belonging within the book itself. There was examples of friendship, sort of one-way friendship with characters. But one thing that really did come through quite strongly is sort of the integrity as well. I mean, those were fiction books, but there was a lot of focus on if a book was set in a particular location that the reader was familiar with. Um, it was important the facts about that location were correct, or that impacted the well-being kind of benefits that book could provide. It was also important that for some readers that the author perhaps had experience of the things they were writing about, and they like to sort of learn a bit more about the author in that way. Again, lots of examples of connection with family and friends. And this was quite interesting because people were either kind of enjoyed social reading activities and attending book groups, or they preferred to sort of maybe have more one-to-one conversations and enjoyed those sort of interactions with family and close friends. And they sort of tended to prefer one or the other, I think, in some ways. But similar to kind of both experiences was just the enjoyment of hearing other people's perspectives, learning other people's viewpoints. And there was a lot of focus on not necessarily the content of the books, but on how it made people feel and the emotions that were connected to that. And that linked in really nicely what we'd found in some of the previous literature with this idea of emotional focus at this stage in life. Reading was often described as a connecting tool with children, with grandchildren. And one of the things that we didn't actually ask about in the interviews, but came up in many of the interviews, was a real sense of sort of hope and almost urgency that future generations will get the same enjoyment out of reading that they've experienced across their lifespan. And many of the older adults expressed that within the interviews. Finally, personal growth. So what we might learn about ourselves and others and about the world. There were lots of examples of introspection and reflection on sort of past life experiences. And you can see in the top quote on the screen there are even some instances of people thinking about how certain books had made them rethink things that happen in their lives or change their attitude slightly towards things and had really powerful impacts. And I think the older adults really, really enjoyed kind of this aspect of the interview and really reflecting and thinking back on those powerful books that they'd read throughout their lives, or even just thinking about their reading history and thinking about how their sort of interests and things had changed and how that reflected them as a person. And there was lots of interest in that as part of the interview. One thing that came through as well quite strongly was this sense of gratitude, and that often the books that they'd read had made them sort of have a sense of gratitude for their own lives. And again, we know that gratitude is important from a well-being perspective. Many of the readers talked about selecting books that offered learning opportunities, so improving knowledge about history, for example, but also just books that maybe covered topics, again, that might be quite sensitive or might give you ideas of ways to support social interaction with other people in your lives. And that seemed to be quite important aspects of their reading choices. And then finally, empathy and understanding. There was lots of examples of understanding the perspectives of the people, the places, or the cultures, events they've never experienced and may never go on to experience. And I don't think I can say it any better than the final quote on the bottom of the screen there, where one of our readers was talking about empathy and an understanding of humanity as being a real core of reading. And again, that sort of thing was echoed throughout many of the interviews. So finally, just to think about the future research, and I think one thing we'd really like to say is we're very keen to work with yourselves, work with the library sector, work with the community sector, work with older adults, and really think about how we can kind of pool our resources and our experiences together to move this research forward. It would be great to really understand the mechanisms behind the sort of the wider role of reading in relation to wellbeing. So different demographics, some of these barriers to reading that we might begin to discuss today. The role of non-fiction, perhaps audiobooks, there's many different things, lots of different things we could look at. But I think there's real potential there to perhaps work together and think about some of these things. Again, if there's ways that we can support your work, we're interested in sort of the optimal ways to support older social reading activities. We'd be really interested in that. And again, one of the things that definitely came out through the interviews is that the adults really seem to kind of enjoy this sort of lifespan perspective of the interviews and reflecting back over it and thinking about their reading and what it's meant to them as a person and how it's influenced their lives. So thinking about ways that we can support that would be great too. So thank you very much for listening, for having me along today. I have to say thank you so much to all of our participants who generously shared their reading experience, and of course to our funders and our partners as well. And if you have any questions at all or would like any further information about the paper that comes out of this work or anything like that, please feel free to get in touch. I'm now going to pass on to Helen Parker, who is a Reading for Wellbeing Officer at Newcastle Libraries, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her perspectives on supporting older adult reading. Thank you.
Oh, Helen, you are on mute. Sorry.
It's a classic. Someone's got to do it, haven't they? Hi, I'll try again. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me along today. I'm Helen Parker. I'm part of the Reading for Wellbeing team at Newcastle Libraries. And today I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of the Reading for Wellbeing project and a little bit about its history. It's not a project exclusively for older adults, but throughout I'm going to try and just put a little bit of a spotlight on older adults just because of the theme of today. But I'll talk more generally about our work across the lifespan as well. So I'm going to reflect a little bit about what we're hearing about older adults, what they're telling us about the barriers to reading and accessing libraries. I'm going to reflect on some of the insights from the NIHR evaluation that was done of the pilot project and how we've tried to apply that to practice in our project so far. And then I'm going to do a little bit of reflection about some of the gaps between the research and practice and have a bit of a critical conversation about how we can improve accessibility to reading for wellbeing. So the Reading for Wellbeing project was initiated by the author Anne Cleeves, who's probably most well known for her writing the Vera novels, amongst many others. And she's someone who's really passionate about the role of wellbeing and reading for wellbeing, and working in the community to raise awareness of that and increase accessibility. So the overall aim of that project is to support people to discover and share the health and wellbeing benefits of reading for pleasure. So the original project started in sort of 2020 in a few local authority areas across the Northeast, and now it's in its sort of second phase where it's been rolled out to more areas. So now in 10 areas of the Northeast, including Newcastle. So we're kind of joining it in this sort of phase 2 of the project. And we're funded for 2 years, funded by our public health team here in Newcastle, who are really, really forward thinking about the role of culture and libraries in public health. So yeah, since March, we've just been in that project development and pilot phase, kind of working out what's going to work in our communities. So now we're just moving into more of a test and learn phase where we're sort of launching more groups, trying out different things, ahead of looking forward to March 2025, where we're going to sort of consultate and evaluate things. So we're still very new. So we're by no means experts on this. We're just kind of reflecting on our experience so far, and how we've kind of used the evidence to sort of develop our service. So I'm just going to flash up. This is our kind of broad leaflet. I'll just zoom into the bit so you can see a little bit better. But our overall offer is a mixture of kind of one-to-one and group activities. So we do have some one-to-one support that we can offer to people. In our initial project development, we found that lots of people didn't really want to join groups, but they really wanted to get into reading or get back into reading after a lapse. So we offer kind of a short period of time. We sort of think of it as the the Couch to 5K app that is all about getting you running. It's kind of the equivalent for that, but for reading and accessing libraries. But the main body of our work is around group activities. And we knew that in Newcastle, there were a whole range of reading groups that already were in existence. They used library spaces and library books, but mostly just ran themselves. So we knew that that was available for people who wanted to and had the ability to join them. So we thought about, well, what's our role? What are we adding to that? And how can we reach different audiences who don't currently come into libraries or don't feel for whatever reason that those groups are accessible for them. So we're in the process of kind of starting and setting up groups, some of them in libraries themselves, open to the public and anyone to join, but a lot of them are in partnership with other organisations who work with people with particular difficulties, whether that's mental health difficulties or difficulties with addiction. We work with some women's groups and that kind of thing. So we do a lot of outreach work into other organisations who work with people already to try and kind of bring different audiences into the library through our group activities. And all of that is designed to kind of open up the universal offer that the library already has. So, raising awareness of all the resources, the online resources, and just the library spaces themselves. And yeah, this is the team. So myself, I'm an occupational therapist by background, and so come from bring a health perspective, and then there's Charlotte and Chris. So Charlotte is a teacher, so she's brings a lot of her expertise from education, and Chris is a social worker. So between ourselves, we're a little bit of a dream team, coming lots of different perspectives, but never worked in libraries before. So it's been a really big learning curve for us as well. So firstly, I'm just going to reflect about just some of the things that older adults have told us about their barriers to reading. So this is kind of just anecdotal, or it's not come from any research. It's just kind of a sense of what people were telling us. And we've kind of broken these down into sort of 3 different categories, really. So a lot of people talked about disruptions to habits and routines around reading and accessing libraries. A lot of it based around like before and after COVID, basically. So lots of people hadn't been to the library before COVID, or used to go to a group, but now they don't run it, or I'm not sure if that's on anymore. And a lot of things around like friendships that kind of came and gone, or people used to do things together, but now they don't. So there's a lot of that disruption to habit that's kind of caused, just a break in people's reading habits. The second is more around that green category of practical barriers that can cause a bit of a feeling of estrangement from libraries. You know, if it's just small practical things like the library card is expired and they don't know how to renew it, or they've got those online, automatic machines now for renewals and I don't know how they quite work, or the opening times have changed. So quite small practical things, but people feeling a little bit one step removed from the library service. And then those ones in red are more about that self-perception of reader role and how that's changed over time, whether that's things like deterioration of eyesight or memory, and that idea that, oh, I can't read anymore because of those sorts of things, or if they've just never been a reader and I'm not going to start now, so why should I bother, that kind of thing. So against that backdrop, we thought about, you know, the research available and how that might inform our work. And in particular, there was a research project by the NIHR of the first phase of the Reading for Wellbeing project that looked at some of the mechanisms behind what engaged readers in this kind of community work. So yeah, it was published in the Medical Humanities Journal and talked about the salutogenic potential of reading for pleasure. So a lot of our kind of inspiration really has come from this research project and its findings. And I've picked out four themes that I'll just reflect on and give some examples of how we've used that in our project development so far. So I'll take one of these in turn and just give you a bit of a flavour of how we've applied that. So that first one is around supporting people to find new ways of enjoying books. So whether that's different formats, trying different authors and genres, or different ways of finding time to read. So an example of that is a group we've started in the main city library in Newcastle, which we've sort of called the Library Book Pick and Mix. So it's not a traditional reading group as such. It's a kind of a weekly drop-in session where we kind of curate a collection of books on a topical theme. Last week we did the Great North Run because that was kind of going on, a big event in our region. So we had all different books related to running and the event itself and people who are kind of prominent figures within that. So it's often a mixture of fiction books, non-fiction books, historical text, a graphic novel, a recipe book. And the idea is just to increase people's awareness of the diverse range of reading material that the library's got to offer, but also kind of increase confidence in using the library and kind of connecting with others along their reading journey to sort of try different things and challenge themselves to think differently about what a book or what reading might be. A different way we've approached that is we've started this series of events called Steps and Stories. So these are guided audiobook walking groups where people join us in one of the city's green spaces and listen to an audiobook while on the walk, followed by a bit of an opportunity to share any reflections on the experience or what they were listening to. And we've trialed these over the summer, and yeah, we've had some really interesting feedback and some really interesting successes in terms of people who never even knew about audiobooks, didn't know you could get them via the libraries. People who'd never had that experience before. But again, that just gives people a different way of reading. If they're very, very busy, you know, they can do it while they're walking the dog or doing the washing up. And it's just raised people's awareness of different ways of reading that perhaps they hadn't thought about before. The second theme that was really helpful was this idea of foregrounding reading as self-care. So encouraging people to acknowledge that reading, you know, is a valid way of caring themselves, taking time for themselves, you know, in spite of some difficult challenges that they've got going on. And that reading itself and activities around reading can give kind of structure and purpose to people's either daily, weekly or monthly schedules. And we've really built this into quite a few groups that we started, I guess, around recovery in different ways. So we've started groups alongside organisations who support people with addiction, recovery from addiction, from mental health difficulties. And in those, we've really focused on, you know, encouraging people to think about the role that reading as a leisure activity might have in their recovery. So either as a kind of a way of distracting themselves or kind of traveling or having adventures that are completely different from their experiences, or reading about people who have had experiences that are close to their own as a way of therapeutically sort of working through some of the challenges that they've got at the moment. So, you know, that's been a really helpful way of us thinking about that particular area. Excuse me. The third area is around focusing on connectiveness in group reading activities in particular. So choosing diverse topics and structuring discussions around that to really understand themselves and others, and using books as a catalyst for connection. And I think this in particular has been apparent in our groups for older adults. We found that even if they read quite a lot at home, actually people have really valued kind of that opportunity to come together and share and experience other people's perspectives. So we've started a few groups that kind of build that in. We do one we call Culture Fridays, which is, it's not just about books and reading, but kind of a broader cultural appreciation group where people kind of can discuss books, films, music, local history. And it's kind of that there's no set agenda. It's very kind of user-led in terms of people's interests, or people kind of sharing their interest in a particular topic. And then next week we look into that a little bit more depth. And similarly, we've created sharing stories, reading groups, and digital reading groups as well. So one of the things we've worked alongside in Newcastle is our digital inclusion team, who get online courses for people to learn how to navigate the internet, use a tablet. So as an offer at the end of that, we've started digital reading groups so that people can apply their digital skills to a reading activity and kind of carry on that group but focused on the reading activity rather than just the digital side of things, which has been really successful. Another way we're thinking of using this idea of the reading as a catalyst for connection, we're just starting this. It's not something we've kind of done yet, but we're launching it this autumn, is a project we're calling Tales Across Time. And this is hopefully going to be an intergenerational project, and hopefully using volunteer reading facilitators, where we're going to link young people and older people for shared story times in residential settings for older people. Again, this idea that the reading activity brings different people together. People can see different perspectives across the generations who perhaps wouldn't usually kind of have that interaction, and using reading as a catalyst for doing that. So we're really excited about developing that as our next project as well. And then the last theme that I'm going to draw a little bit around is kind of this idea of enabling environments. Something that the research really kind of found was that creating spaces where people could feel comfortable and using personality and humour to help people feel at ease really helped them to overcome individual barriers to reading. And for this, we've been really lucky in terms of our staff development. We've had some really helpful bespoke training on creating inclusive environments, things like active listening and developing therapeutic relationships. We had a bespoke training program by an organisation called Opening the Book, which has been really formative in our planning and how we're starting to deliver our work, and realizing that actually a lot of our work is around developing relationships. We're not kind of the posh, scary lady at the library who's going to bring in the whole collection of Shakespeare and expect you to analyze it. It's kind of using your personability to kind of make reading in libraries more accessible. And also we've worked in collaboration with an organisation called Beyond Words, who focus on creating word-free picture books for people with learning disabilities, or who would prefer kind of image-based reading rather than text. And then just yesterday, actually, I started a new book based on that, which we're calling the Open Book Club. So again, it's a word-free book club for people with learning disabilities or autism. And the main focus of that is about kind of creating an inclusive space where people can participate on their own terms. Some people just sat there and didn't say anything the whole way through, but actually some feedback we got at the end was that they really valued that, and just that opportunity to sit there in a space and not feel expected to say anything. That was really valuable. In that, we also bring in a more shared reading approach. So we do some poetry read aloud that then we can discuss. And again, that just breaks down barriers for people who perhaps have lower literacy, or would feel that reading isn't for them because of whatever kind of level of reading they have. So lastly, I'm just going to reflect very quickly about some of the sort of gaps we've experienced between research and practice, and thinking critically about applying these research findings. One of the things that really interested me in the pilot evaluation that I've been talking about, they talk about self-identification as a reader or a positive affiliation with reading for pleasure were key factors that affected participation in these interventions. And also that the people who were engaged in the evaluation were already considering reading to be a positive experience. And similarly to what Nicola was describing, we've definitely seen that kind of in practice, that, you know, for obviously people who are readers or have read and kind of just want to get back into it, that's kind of, you know, it's one thing, but actually we've encountered lots of other barriers, wider sort of social cultural barriers to the potential benefit of reading for pleasure that perhaps aren't quite captured in some of this research. So things like low literacy levels. We know across the Northeast, for example, that the average adult literacy level is between ages of 9 and 11. So that's kind of a massive barrier straight away in terms of how people perceive their own reading ability and therefore their ability to participate in some of these projects. It might be that English is a second language, and obviously we have very diverse community here in Newcastle, so that's something that we've been really mindful of. And then just broader things like people having a negative experience of reading at school, or associations with libraries as middle class spaces that aren't for them. Also, you know, we have council lanyards and lots of council services are based within library buildings, and some people can find that quite intimidating because of negative experiences with the council systems. And that, yeah, just huge broader problems like poverty, housing issues, benefits. You know, people have a lack of time and headspace to really consider reading or library activities as a priority for them. But in a way, these are people who could perhaps benefit the most from some of these projects. So we don't have any answers for that. We're kind of really keen to foreground that in our work, because I think there's a risk that sometimes some of these projects can become quite blinkered. Whereas if we're really kind of trying to open up and diversify who uses library spaces, I think we need to be quite critical about some of these issues. So yeah, that's kind of my little question there for you at the end, and a bit of a critical thought. But as I said, we're really early in our project, and we're really interested in kind of reaching out for any comments or questions, or anyone who's interested in working with us. We're trying to build some research partnerships locally with Northumbria University and some of our local partners around how we can use research to evaluate what we're doing. But if anyone else has got any ideas for collaboration, we'd really welcome you to kind of get in touch and work together.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was fascinating. Thank you. And although you say you're early on in the process, all the things you've done have been absolutely amazing. So I'm going to move us on speedily, because I hope there'll be some time for questions at the end. But to introduce you to Dr. Karina Spalding from the Reading Agency, who's going to finish us off with all the research that you've been doing, Karina, around reading and wellbeing. So I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you. So it's just said, I'm here from the Reading Agency, and I think most of you will probably be familiar with us, but in the instance that you're not, we are a UK-wide charity working to empower people of all ages to transform their lives through reading, and we do that to support outcomes like life skills and learning, health and well-being, and connected communities. Through providing programs of activities for all ages, so things like our flagship programs, Summer Reading Challenge and Reading Well, among many others, delivering national campaigns through our work with really valued partners, of course, such as public libraries, prisons, hospitals, and other community settings. But we also do that through our really extensive research and evaluation work, and that's what I'll be focusing on here today. So for many years, we have tracked adult reading engagement through our projects and programs, but also looking at reading engagement at the national level. And over the past several years, we, along with many of you and many others in the sector, have identified a real gap in the up-to-date evidence on when, how often, and why adults are engaging in reading. There's really extensive amounts of data highlighting children and teens' reading habits, and rightly so. It's very important to have those engagement points too. We found there's just a real lack of data on adult reading since, of course, the OECD piece in 2013, tracking adult reading skills, as well as our last big commission piece on reading engagement in 2015. So we've done some smaller scale surveys since 2020, and smaller scale in terms of the number of questions, not the number of respondents. But this year, we've really put efforts into revitalizing that evidence base. So this survey and the reading engagement measures that we use were designed using our Peter Sowerby Foundation funded Reading Outcomes Framework. And that framework, some of you might be familiar with, it identifies the outcomes of reading for pleasure and provides us with a set of tools to measure those. So we've used those consistently throughout time and throughout each of these surveys. So it's looking, using those same measures in 2015 as we did now in 2020, 21, 22, and 24, to measure things like reading frequency, wider reading engagement behaviors, reading confidence, barriers to reading, and attitudes towards reading. And for the purposes of this survey and for us at the Reading Agency, reading is defined as reading that takes place by choice rather than for work or education, and can include any kinds of reading material. So that might be books, ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, graphic novels, poetry, blogs, and more. So we're looking at that very, very broadly imagined. The survey that we're looking at in the research today, and all of the surveys that we've done are statistically weighted to be nationally representative. While we've had almost 12,000 respondents across these set of 5 surveys, the ones from the data from 2024 are from 2003 respondents. So today I'll be giving a brief overview of our findings in general, followed by a focus on data specific to the groups and themes that have been discussed here today, so namely older adults and health and well-being. And I should say older adults, when we get to that point, it is defined here as 55 plus, so I do apologize to anybody who might be shocked to find themselves in that age range there, but for the purposes of the data today, that's the group I'm looking at. So at a national level, the data paints quite a concerning picture around adult reading engagement. It shows that only half of UK adults regularly read for pleasure, and 35% are lapsed readers. So that means that they used to read regularly, but now have since dropped that habit. We find that just over 10% of people struggle with reading confidence, finding reading always or usually difficult, and that rises to 22% of young adults. And those younger adults, and that age range includes those up to 34, face the greatest barriers to reading compared to that UK average. So including things like lower enjoyment of reading, difficulty focusing on reading for more than a few minutes, and challenges finding relatable content. However, there are, of course, many benefits to a regular reading habit. And to give just a few examples of that, our regular readers of all ages report a range of positive benefits, such as improved mental health and well-being, which 44% of those regular readers agreed with, that it contributed to a better night's sleep at 41%, and improved concentration levels at 34%. Our data also shows a very strong correlation between a regular reading habit and higher life satisfaction. So 62% of regular readers report high or very high levels of life satisfaction, compared to 47% and 45% of lapsed and non-readers, respectively. Looking at the 3 highest levels, so 8 to 10 of life satisfaction, we find that 46% of regular readers report that, compared to 27% of lapsed readers and 31% of non-readers. So while we can't, of course, say that there's a direct link or there's any kind of causation here, we do see that correlation, and that correlation has been reinforced in that data set since 2015 and beyond, and in wider data sets as well. So it's a strong correlation. So bringing it to our quote unquote older adults here, that age 55 plus age range, this graph highlights our breakdown of those who consider themselves regular readers. So at the top there is that UK average across all ages, with our 50% half regular readers, 35% lapsed, and 15% non-readers. Here we defined a regular reading habit as reading at least on a weekly basis, with reading types and formats being open to that wider range of materials. So as mentioned, that half of UK adults are regular readers, but we can see that there's a larger proportion of those age 55 plus reading regularly, and fewer lapsed readers and non-readers accordingly. We see that also reflected in their relationship with reading as well. So people aged 55 plus said that reading is an important part of their life, much higher than the national average. So 2 in 3 people aged 55 plus felt that reading was an important part of their life, compared to 60% of the national average. Putting that weekly habit into more concrete numbers, this graph shows the number of hours spent reading each week across age ranges. we can see that those age 55 plus are reading the most at 3.14 hours per week. That's higher than the national average and higher than other age ranges. But I should note that it's a drop from 2015 when those age 55 plus were reading 4.6 hours a week. In terms of what they're reading, fiction and nonfiction books and news articles and newspapers are the most popular reading materials. Looking at wider reading engagement habits, though, we start to see some interesting, slightly contradictory trends from what we might expect. Those age 55 plus tend to engage in these less frequently than the national average. So things like borrowing books from the library, buying books from bookstores or charity shops, borrowing books from family or friends, even talking about reading with other people and reading together with family are all significant, well, not significant in terms of statistical significance, but are all markedly lower than the national average there. That indicates that this age group is reading regularly, but not necessarily taking advantage of those social or community aspects of reading, and is at odds with what the public narrative or some of our preconceptions around that age range might show. Breaking that data down to a more individual level, though, we can see that the people who do engage in those behaviors tend to engage in many of them. So, for example, people who are book club members in this age range also are more frequent library users, read together more with family, borrow and share books with their friends and family more. So nevertheless, despite those reading engagement patterns, we do see lots of benefits of reading and thinking specifically about those health and well-being benefits of reading for those age 55 plus. So we asked people to share what they felt reading has helped them with. And looking specifically at those health and well-being benefits, we find that those age 55 plus are about on par with the national average across all age ranges in those perceived benefits, with slightly higher perceived benefits around the mental health and well-being impact than the national average. So those health and well-being benefits are things like improving my mental health and well-being, which we have 36% of those age 55 plus agreeing with, getting a better night's sleep, improved concentration levels, improved self-confidence, and increased ability to cope with difficult situations. Those latter two, of course, are slightly lower than the national average. Similarly, we can see that health and well-being factors also rank highly and higher than the national average as driving factors for reading. So we asked people to share why, if at all, they find reading important, giving them 12 options. They could tick any that apply, and that was the same for the last one there. So those added up to more than 100%. And those age 55 plus said that they found reading important to relax, and that's 70% versus 59% from the national average, to enjoy themselves, 57% versus 45% from the national average, and to escape from the real world, with 53% agreeing with that versus 43% for the national average. And these health and well-being motivations of those 12 reasons came in as the top 5, with the exception of one, which was to learn about new things, which fell at 51%. So that was the only non-health and well-being related factor in the top 5 for this age range. On the flip side of that, we also asked people to share what stops them from reading, to identify those key barriers to reading. So that was things like mental health related reasons, difficult life events, vision related reasons, physical health related reasons. And we found, interestingly, that those health and well-being related barriers, such as poor vision or poor physical or mental health, all fell much lower than the national average for those age 55 plus. And if we look at those age 45 to 54, those barriers around vision, mental health, poor physical health, all ranked much, much higher than the national average. So it's that age range just before that are being most impacted by this. So that doesn't indicate that people, and very, very clearly doesn't indicate that people over age 55 aren't experiencing those challenges. And we heard very much so from both Nicola and Helen around how people over age 55 are experiencing those challenges. But crucially here, we see that it's not actually stopping them from reading. And that evidence, it's evidenced by the far higher percentage of those age 55 plus who say that nothing stops them from reading. So over half of those age 55 plus agreed with that statement versus 28% for the national average. I found that really interesting when Nicola was speaking earlier about ways that people were thinking about how they could continue to incorporate reading into their lives as their vision started deteriorating, for example. And our data shows that at the national level, people are more or less achieving that. But we know that the relationship to health and well-being isn't the only way that adults engage with reading. And moving away from that age range specifically, we also know that many access information through books and reading to help them manage their health and well-being. And so we asked about that as well. We asked about people's interest, you know, whether or not they agreed with the statement, I'm interested in reading more about managing my health and well-being. 1 in 3 adults said they wanted to read more books about managing their health and well-being, and that rose to half of those aged 25 to 44 years old. You can see it thinking about our 55 plus range, they're at the lowest end of that, with only 18% agreeing with that statement. Whether they can find and access those books is another question. However, 1 in 5 UK adults tell us that it's difficult to find books about managing their health and well-being, and that rises to 1 in 4 for 35 to 44-year-olds and to 1 in 3 for 16 to 34-year-olds. So while those health and well-being benefits and motivations might be there in the older age range, that kind of health information, health development is much stronger in the younger age ranges. That was a very, very whistle-stop tour of some of our insights from the data, and I'm happy to talk about any of that in more detail, and you'll definitely get the slides from this. I know I went through those graphs very quickly. But overall, it shows some really intriguing findings around reading engagement patterns. Shows that those age 55 plus are more likely to be regular readers. They're more likely to read more hours per week and longer form reading materials than other age groups. They're also more likely to value the role of reading in their lives and see that as an important part of their day and week. But they seem to engage less frequently in wider reading engagement habits, such as library use or book buying, and less frequently in social reading behaviors, like sharing their reading with others, which is potentially a gap that could be latched onto for development, for example, and development in the ways that Helen's doing amazing work with already. Again, linking in with the findings shown by Nicola and Helen today, as well, things like relaxation, escapism, and support for mental health are all real key drivers for reading, and are also those main benefits experienced by people over 55. Thinking about health information and empowering people to manage their health and well-being, the data also shows that younger adults have that strong interest in doing so, though they struggle to find it, which is another key area for potential support, and thinking about the ways that libraries can support younger adults to help find that information that they're clearly searching for. In terms of next steps and future research, we're continuing to analyze the data. We've got so much here, and it's really, every time we look through it and every time we cut it in a new way, there are new insights coming out of it. So we're continuing to analyze that and identify new areas for development, and thinking about how we can use that information to help us develop our work and reach and engage people more effectively, and what might be stopping them from engaging, but also thinking about what to look at in our next research piece. So we're then, to that end, working towards a larger research project next year, hopefully trying to work with a larger sample size, potentially a more granular demographic data, as well as to build on and speak to and potentially use this data to identify some research aims for the really great qualitative work and qualitative studies that are going on. And so really, really keen to work with other researchers and other libraries to pursue some of those aims. So that's me. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karina. Gosh, that was amazing, and so fascinating findings. It's really interesting. A couple of things just sprung to my mind. One was that interesting thing about the sort of the social engagement and reading, and how we sort of make sure that libraries are maximising the opportunities for that, and making people aware of that, and the benefits of that too. And the other thing, I don't know if anyone's here from the Vision and Print Impaired People's Promise today, but it feels like, that's kind of been flowing through the presentations in an interesting way in Karina's, but actually feels like we need to make real connections between like the reading offer and the Vision and Print Impaired People's Promise for this work. We've got a couple of comments in the chat, really questions, but Sarah's asked particularly about she wants to ask about, she's keen to properly research a health related reading literacy project, but not sure how to start. Can anyone offer some advice? So, Nicola, have you got any advice for Sarah about that?
Yeah, I'd be really happy if Sarah wanted to drop me an email with some information about what she'd like to do, and I'm very happy to meet online or something to chat about that and to give some advice if that will be useful. Yeah, feel free to drop me an email, Sarah, and I can chat to you about it.
Brilliant, thank you. Any thoughts from either Karina or Helen? I don't want to.
Yeah, similarly here as well. We have partners with we have partnered with various libraries services on different research projects, as well as ones that link across us, that library, and a university partner too. So I'm very happy to speak.
Thank you. And then
Thank you.
Sarah's also asked about, Sarah, you talked about that way of gathering feedback looks great in its simplicity. So many of our library users have feedback form fatigue. And I think you were relating, Sarah, that was for Helen's examples, wasn't it? I believe.
So that was for the books beyond words, that I found that very useful, but I think that could be useful in any number of situations.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's amazing. So, I suppose one question, just because I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, and it's been a really brilliant session. And what I've loved about it is how many synergies there are. Shouldn't be a surprise, but there are synergies between what you're all saying and sort of giving us a really clear steer about how we engage with those older readers and older adults who maybe either elapsed or are not reading. But if there's one message that you would give us as library staff to say, what should we be doing to engage our older community in reading?
I can go first, if you like.
That'd be great.
I think from our side of things, maybe like an individualized approach wherever possible. I know it's not always possible. And that sense of belonging definitely are two things that came through for us. Yeah, individualized wherever possible, and yeah, really creating that sense of belonging initially as a first step, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. How about from you, Helen?
I guess from our experience, it's a lot about bringing the library out to people rather than just waiting for people to come into the libraries. Sometimes you have to think a bit creatively about, how you engage people. And, we're all really passionate about libraries and we all love reading, and that's kind of why we're in it. But sometimes you have to put aside your own perceptions and realize that actually sometimes the barrier is the physical building of the library. And when you think about reading, think about reading and stories and engaging in that rather than the library as a concept. And then I think if you engage people in reading and stories, then people will come to libraries rather than just waiting for people to come into the physical building itself. So I think it's about, raising accessibility to enjoying stories as the first thing, and then everything else will follow.
Yeah, brilliant, great advice, thank you. And then Karina.
Yeah, I very much agree with both of those. I think looking at the data, it's clear that if people in that age range aren't engaging right now, but we know they're engaging so strongly in reading, there must be some kind of gap. There must be something missing there. So, bringing it outside into other community spaces could be one way to do that, as Helen said. And I think also on the individualized approach that you talked about, Nicola, I think it's easy to look at that data and see, 6% or 6% versus 13% are saying that poor vision is stopping them from reading. Well, 6% is still 3 million people, more than 3 million people. So it's might not be as many as that national average, but it's still a very sizable number. So any way that we can increase accessibility, meet people where they are, is really the key.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one quick question that sneaked in under the radar from Rachel. So thank you, Rachel, for that. And she's asking Helen, she's asking you about engagement and participation event attendance at your events and how you get the message out.
We're very new, so some of our groups have only been running for a couple of months, and sometimes the first session of one of my groups, that only one lady came, and you just have to roll with it. But then the next time she brought her friend, and then the next time someone else found about it through this other means, and then slowly but surely we're gathering a bit of pace. So in terms of numbers, we're still quite small. We might get 5 or 6 people come into group, and that's fantastic, but we're hoping to grow that as we go. In terms of getting the message out, particularly to older people, it's obviously challenging because some of the more online social media, that perhaps they wouldn't see it. So it's going as again, like going through organizations or networks where people might already be receiving their information. So for example, we have a really active Elders Council of Newcastle with a really active kind of newsletter that gets sent out and readership of that. So that's been really helpful for us. And sometimes just giving out leaflets, standing around, a good old-fashioned poster, that's sometimes as powerful as the fanciest kind of promotional campaign. So I think a diversity of ways of getting the word out for people, but also using networks that already exist, and going about it that way has been successful for us so far.
Fantastic. Well, I'm conscious of the webinar time's up, so I just wanted to say a huge thank you. That's been really fascinating this afternoon. I really enjoyed listening to you all. So thanks to Nicola and Karina and Helen. Really interesting session. And we will be sharing the slides as PDFs afterwards. So anyone who, I think someone said they couldn't see the bottom of the screen or something, but hopefully that will be cleared up when you get the slides. But just a big thank you. Thank you for the questions and the comments in the chat. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. So thank you all.
Thank you.